Hello lovelies. In this video the brilliant Dr. Abways is going to be going through carrying capacity for your A-level biology. So all of the details that you need to know, all of the bits that link together that need to be recalled for your exam to help you remember everything. On the website there is a set of questions that are free that go just with this video.
Okay, so we're going to look at population size and carrying capacity. So this is kind of looking at the idea of how these organisms are going to interact within these ecosystems and think about population size, the factors that affect population size. This is something we've looked at and will have looked at GCSE. We've just not really talked about it in this way before. So population size is the total number of organisms of one species in one habitat. Carrying capacity, which is our new term, is the maximum stable population size of a species that an ecosystem can support. Many biotic and abiotic factors affect population size. These will then also affect the carrying capacity. That makes sense. That normally happens over a longer period of time. So some abiotic factors that affect population size, these are not new, these are things we've been talking about since GCSE. So availability of light, water, space, temperature, chemical composition of the surroundings like pH, oxygen, or mineral availability. So you can see my graph here. I've got an increase and then a decrease in the animal population within this ecosystem. So all these animals go through the same increase and decrease through the year. And there's a reason why, and it makes sense why, these changes can be seasonal. So when conditions are favourable, more organisms will be able to survive and reproduce, so the population size increases and we get up to that peak. And then when conditions are bad or something happens to change it, then the population decreases. This change happens seasonally because, as we know, during spring there's lots of food around, there's lots of births and reproduction, so the population increases. And then as we get through the summer, maybe we have weather incidents, maybe it gets very dry, maybe there's no rain, maybe there's not as much food around, or we've eaten all the food and suddenly there's all of these animals that have grown and reproduced and we've got large populations and the environment can't provide for them all the way through the summer, so we start to decline. Maybe there's hunting happens because obviously suddenly when there's loads of food in spring, predators come out and start eating all the prey, and so that's going to decrease our animal population back down to sort of the autumn time, and then the organisms that are left are the ones that have survived, reproduced, and then they'll be breeding and reproducing new organisms in that springtime again. So it's the ones that survive till the end of the year, survive over winter, and then are able to breed again in spring. So that links to some of those biotic factors that affect the population. So competition with other organisms, which we're going to look at. Food availability, how much food there is based on factors like the weather could be a link into that, but also just availability of plants or other animals in order to eat. And then pathogens and disease again. So pathogens and diseases spring up in the colder weather, so that's where they can be seasonal, but also things like if you're already hungry and starving because there's not enough food around by the time we get to September, then you're more likely to die from something like a disease or a parasite. So we've got biotic and abiotic factors. We've got this idea of change through the year as well in the seasons. And then we've got these interactions between things like interactions with other animals, like predator-prey, interactions with other animals like competition. So we're going to have a deep dive into those two and have a look at how that actually affects the population size and kind of look at how we interpret graphs about this and look a bit more at this term carrying capacity. Okay, so as well as being biotic and abiotic, there's other ways we can describe these two types of factors. One is that the abiotic factors can be known as density independent factors. So this means that it's not dependent on how large or small the population is within an ecosystem, whether these factors have a greater effect or not. So for example, if it's a really cold temperatures might kill a certain number of the population, but that's regardless of how many organisms there are in the population. If it's a small population, it would still be affected by temperature. Whereas the biotic factors, because they involve organisms, tend to be density-dependent factors. So this is where if there's more or less organisms in the population, these factors may have more or less of an effect. So for example, competition, if you've got more organisms occupying the same space and sharing the same resources, then competition will be greater and have more of an effect on the population. As the population grows and gets larger in numbers, food availability might become more of a factor that affects the survival of the organisms because there's less food to share around. With pathogens and disease, it might be that if you've got a really dense population and therefore they're crammed into a lot of space, they're quite close to each other, a disease might be able to spread more easily through that population. So you can see how the biotic factors can be more or less serious depending on how many organisms there are or how dense the population is. But for the abiotic factors, this often has less of an issue. Okay, so let's have a look at competition. There are two types of competition. Intra-specific competition is the one we're going to look at first. Intra meaning within the same species. So if you are competing with an organism that is the same species as you, then it's intra-specific competition. It occurs when individuals in the same population compete for the same resources. It can cause cyclical change in the population size around the population's carrying capacity, which is where the population grows and shrinks and then grows again. So remember, carrying capacity is kind of that sweet spot of organisms in that population that the ecosystem can support as a stable kind of number. It's not always going to be that perfect number, and as we can see, it will go up and down and up and down around that carrying capacity. But if you go too far beyond it, then that's when changes start happening. So initially at point 1, our graph is kind of increasing and we're going up with time, so the population is growing because there's lots of resources available and there's lots of food and everything, and we're happy and being able to survive and reproduce, and therefore we're breeding lots and the population is growing. Then we hit that peak. So what has happened here is that we've gone too far beyond the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, and so we've exceeded it to a point where it's too much, too large a population, and so resources have become limiting. There's limited food, there's limited space. Animals are competing with each other for food, for space, and so the population starts to fall because there's not enough resources. Animals are going hungry, or they're out competing each other in that space, and so therefore they're not able, less of them are able to survive and reproduce, and so the population falls because more organisms are dying than are breeding. And so it falls down and down and down and down until we get to a point where the population has decreased well below the carrying capacity. There's now less competition for resources again, so the ones that are surviving and reproducing are able to grow and reproduce lots, and then the population starts to recover again and it heads back towards that carrying capacity. And that will go on and on and on in that cycle in the same way. It could be for decades, for generations, unless there are large changes in the carrying capacity to bring it down. And so then that would maybe change the average number of the population, but otherwise it will just go in this kind of pattern. Okay, so now we're looking at inter-specific competition. So intra-specific meant within the same species, so organisms of the same species competing with each other. This is when we look at competition between organisms from different species, so inter meaning between two different species. It occurs when different populations compete for the same resources, for example, food. If they're having to share a food resource, there'll be less available food for both of the populations, so the sizes will be limited and they will not be getting enough energy to grow or reproduce, so that will limit their population size. But if one species becomes better adapted to their surroundings, so they're more able to find food or catch food, or they're bigger or they're heavier, for example, they can outcompete the other one, and that population will decline and then could be wiped out from that habitat. This is exactly the example we looked at in a previous video about red and grey squirrels. So the grey squirrels are larger, they're able to get more nutrition out of their food, they're able to put on more weight and therefore survive the winter better. They're a bit more adapted to certain habitats than the red squirrel. So where they used to overlap, now the grey squirrel has outcompeted them and the red squirrel is basically not found at all in those habitats anymore. And so this is what happens with inter-specific competition, and it can obviously change population size. So competition is obviously where organisms are interacting with each other because they want the same resources or they want the same food, and they're sharing and they're overlapping and they're competing for something. Predator-prey relationships are slightly different because obviously in this case, one of the organisms is food for the other organism. So predation in this sense just means an organism killing and eating another organism as a source of food. The population sizes of predators and prey in an ecosystem, in a community, in a food chain, are interlinked with each other because as one changes, it causes a change in the other population because obviously they're interdependent. As we've seen, the prey population, like in the previous slide, due to competition in their own species, can fluctuate anyway. And then any predation factors has an impact on top of those changes. So examples like the one we're going to look at, and the one that's often used, is the hare and the lynx, so like a rabbit and then like a cat type creature. They're normally used because they come from a very specific habitat where the food web is very small. So there's not many other food sources for the lynx, for example, and so therefore they're literally tied very closely to each other. In reality, the relationships that we're looking at are a lot more complicated than that because normally one predator doesn't just rely on one prey as a food source, and normally there's more than one predator for each species. There's other factors also involved, like we've talked about, like the availability of food for the prey, which could be due to an abiotic factor change. It could be due to competition within their own species. So that fluctuation is going to be happening as well within the hare as a species without the impact of the lynx. And so that can then affect the lynx separately. Predator-prey diagrams normally look like this. You'll have peaks and troughs of predator and prey, and normally the predator diagrams, there's some rules that they follow. So the predator peaks are always on delay, so after the prey peak there will be a predator peak, so they're always normally shifted to the right, and there's always going to be more prey than there are predators. So be careful, some graphs in the exam might use 2 axes, so you could have like hundreds of a predator and then thousands or tens of thousands of a prey. And so because the units might be different, they might put them on different axes. So just be aware, make sure when you are interpreting these graphs, you're really sure which one is prey and which one is predator. So in this case, obviously our hare is the prey, there's more of them, and our lynx is the predator, there's fewer of them, and their graph is down and shifted to the right. So there is a delay in the effect on the population size of the predator after the changes to the population size of the prey. So we need to be able to explain what's happening here. Again, you may have done this at GCSE and it's very similar. So at 1, my lynx population is increasing, and it's increasing after the hare population as there's clearly been an increase in the hare population. So there's a lot more of them to eat. They've got more food available, which means they've got more energy. So they're going to be surviving and reproducing more. And so more babies, lynx, are being born than are dying, and therefore we get an increase in the population. The hare population starts to fall, and it could be due to starvation, because they've reached their carrying capacity or they've exceeded their carrying capacity, they've run out of food, the hare population starts to fall down. It also could be as well that predation is getting easier, there's more lynx, and so there's more predators around. They're finding it easier because there's more hare and because the hare are weaker, because they're running out of food, they're having to compete with each other, so they're easier to catch. These 2 things interplay here, and we get a decrease in the hare population because more of them are being eaten. Then ultimately we get that delay in sort of response from the lynx, but ultimately the lynx suffers the same effect as the hare. So the hare is the food, so remember if they've eaten too much of the hare has disappeared. We've decreased the numbers so much that now there's lack of food for the lynx. The lynx is now obviously potentially competing within their own species, within their population. So less food means less survive and reproduce, so the population numbers fall. We've got more lynx dying than are being born. And then this is going to go up and down and up and down and repeat. The timescale is quite long. We're talking decades here, so kind of one cycle every 10 years or plus years or so. It's not something that happens every season. It's going to happen over sort of large periods of time. Okay, so having a look at carrying capacity graphs and how to explain them. So when the population of a species is below the carrying capacity, then the number of individuals tend to expand exponentially because we have that big increase, because we have lots of resources, everyone's able to survive, reproduce, and we get more births than deaths. So we increase the population. But this causes in many ecosystems, it causes an overshoot. So our population increases so much that we overshoot, like we saw with the hare and in our other diagrams. So we overshoot the carrying capacity, and at some point that means we get to a point where we exceed the carrying capacity so much that resources become limiting, competition increases, and it causes a decline in the population. If the decline is significant, the population may never recover and it could die out. It could just, that green line could carry on going and just stop. Or there's other factors that could then also lower the carrying capacity permanently. So we could get a reduction in carrying capacity, and then when the population recovers, it doesn't ever recover to the same levels. So that can happen as well. But otherwise, that population can come up and then it will go back to fluctuating around the carrying capacity, as we saw. But things that can decrease the carrying capacity, which could be linked to the overshoot, it could be linked to there being too many in a certain population and the ecosystem just not being able to cope with this number of individuals. Or it could be linked to something like climate change. So if something happens, the climate changes, the environment degrades, in that time when we've got that decrease in population, it may no longer be able to support the same numbers of the population it did beforehand. It could be they've depleted some resources so much that they won't come back. If they had eaten a certain number of organisms, if they're a prey species and they've eaten so many of a certain plant or something and there's no way it can come back, then they might never have the same carrying capacity again. It could be because another species that they rely on went extinct. If, for example, the hare went extinct, the lynx would have no food. So that then population is going to be decimated as well. It could be that something that the hare eats goes extinct. A certain plant that the hare eats goes extinct. Then we're going to have a situation where that plant is gone extinct, so there's fewer hare, permanently fewer hare, and therefore the lynx carrying capacity is going to decrease because it literally cannot be sustained by the smaller amount of hare that's present in the population. Or a new competitor could come in, a new organism comes in to compete with the lynx for hare, and then that decreases the lynx carrying capacity because the ecosystem can't support two predators to the level that it did before, so their carrying capacity will be reduced if they're both sharing that food source. Or a pathogen or a disease comes in, wipes out large amounts of the population, and it takes a very long time for them to recover. So that's the type of thing we're looking at if we're looking at graphs like this, or we're trying to explain how changes in population can affect changes in carrying capacity and vice versa. You can also see this similar way of explaining carrying capacity graphs in the bacterial growth curve that we've looked at. So with the lag phase, the exponential, the log phase, and then the stationary phase, and then the death phase, it's exactly the same way of using that terminology and those patterns that we looked at when we looked at bacterial growth. You can do exactly the same thing to describe carrying capacity because it's still organisms multiplying, using up resources within a closed system. So those patterns and those graphs and that description and explanation of those graphs is very similar to how you would describe any population in a closed situation. There are two different ways that populations can approach this idea of population growth and carrying capacity. They can either be K or R strategists. So where K, obviously here I'm referring to K as carrying capacity, and then R is kind of reproduction rate. So they're either kind of trying to aim for a certain carrying capacity or trying to aim for a high reproduction rate. So first let's look at K strategists. These tend to be birds, larger mammals, including humans, but things like elephants and stuff like that, and larger plants like large trees. We call these K strategists because their population size is determined by the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. This means that limiting factors of the ecosystem will have a significant effect on the population size. They will grow and increase in number until they reach the carrying capacity, and then they will fluctuate and stay around that carrying capacity. Common features of K strategist populations are that they will have low reproduction rate, long lifespan, large body masses, and generally slow development, which means that their young are born kind of underdeveloped and take quite a long time to reach adulthood. So there we go, I've got some birds, some trees, and some elephants as some examples of K strategists. R strategists then tend to be the opposite, and this can be considered like a continuum or a spectrum where not every population is going to be either one or the other. There can be in-betweens as well. But things like bacteria, mice, weeds, insects, and also pioneer species. So thinking back to succession when we looked at that. The population grows so quickly that it exceeds the carrying capacity of its ecosystem really quickly. And because the population grows so rapidly, the reproduction rate is really high, it actually gets to carrying capacity before limiting factors have a time to actually cause an effect on the population size. Obviously then, once they exceed the carrying capacity, there will be a massive drop in the population numbers. So this is known as like a boom and bust population technique. So the organisms, like we said, so small organisms, so they will have a rapid reproduction rate, which we know we see a lot in bacteria. They will have a short lifespan, so they're relatively short-lived. They will have small body mass and they quickly develop. And again, their young will sort of become adults and become sexually mature and start reproducing quite quickly as well. All of this allows for quick colonization of a new area. So this is why pioneer species are included. So they quickly come in, they can colonize an area, and then they're gone again, and then they're replaced by something else once they overextend their carrying capacity.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.